1989年咧，對全世界好多人嚟講咧，都可以講話係震撼人心嘅一年。中國人唔使問啦，因為呢一年咧有6.4事件，令到中國人咧係非常之感觸，甚至係悲嘆。對東歐同埋西歐嘅人嚟講咧，呢一年咧可以講話係非常之振奮啦，因為咧標誌住東西歐分裂嘅嗰個柏林圍牆咧喺呢一年咧就倒冧。從此以後咧，東歐嘅共產黨政權咧紛紛倒台。最終咧就係歐洲咧就成為一體，而今日咧翻轉頭嚟講咧，我哋大家都可以睇到就係呢10幾年來咧，東歐國家有好大嘅進步，而且咧喺今年咧就係有好多東歐國家咧係加入呢個歐洲經濟嘅共同體，即係歐洲聯盟。好啦，所以呢一套片咧就係以戈爾巴喬夫為開始，以哈維爾即係當時啱啱當選嘅捷克總統哈維爾咧係結束嘅。戈爾巴喬夫喺呢套片一開始嘅時候咧，我哋大家睇到就係佢同教宗會面。嗱，呢個標誌住咧就係蘇聯嘅改革嘅領袖，當時亦都係仲係蘇聯總統，願意咧同天主教會和解啦。其實大家都知道咧，就係教宗若望保禄二世喺促進東歐嘅變革，特別係波蘭變革嗰方面咧，係一個好大嘅精神力量，可以講話咧係扮演咗一個非常之重要嘅角色。嗱，同樣咧喺呢一年咧，若望保禄二世咧，亦都接見咗波蘭團結工會嘅領袖華里莎。華里莎咧喺80年、81年嘅時候咧，成功地令到波蘭嘅團結工會咧成為一個合法嘅獨立嘅工會。呢個咧喺東歐嘅歷史上邊咧係破天荒嘅，因為佢哋從來咧都唔能夠接受一個唔係由共產黨領導嘅組織，特別係群眾組織咧係可以咧就係存在。咁所以咧80、81年咧可以講話係一個好大嘅突破。但係好遺憾咧，喺81年嘅12月，團結工會咧就係被定性為呢個非法組織，華里莎咧從此以後咧就被軟禁。但竟然咧就到咗89年嘅時候咧，華里莎咧係被波蘭政府邀請咧出席一個圓桌會議，因為波蘭咧嗰個政權咧嗰陣時已經係岌岌可危，所以咧佢都係要求咧同團結工會咧就係合作，睇下點樣搞好呢一個國家。呢一個咧即係可以講話象徵住華里莎同埋團結工會嘅勝利。亦都係象徵住咧，就係教宗若望保禄二世嘅勝利，因為教宗其實喺過去咁多年裏邊，無論係79年之前或者係79年之後咧，佢對波蘭嘅民主化咧都起到一個好重大嘅推動作用。喺呢一套片裏邊咧，我哋仲發覺咧就係我哋睇到好多第二次世界大戰嘅片段，因為1989年咧恰恰就係第二次世界大戰爆發嘅50週年紀念。第二次世界大戰咧對波蘭嚟講咧，尤其係慘痛嘅。因為波蘭人當時有2400萬人，但係咧竟然咧有1/4，即係600萬人咧就係被納粹德國所屠殺。咁當然裏邊咧有好多波蘭人，亦都有好多咧係猶太人。咁所以咧成個第二次世界大戰咧可以講話咧係令到成個歐洲生靈塗炭。呢一套片咧當然咧就係即係一方面咧就藉住緬懷過去，希望咧就係歐洲唔好再生靈塗炭啦，唔好再打仗啦。另一方面咧，就係希望咧，就係話藉住呢一個即係柏林圍牆嘅倒冧咧，就係即係展望將來。呢兩個重點啊，即係東歐嘅變革同埋第二次世界大戰咧，可以講話係即係89年嘅事件嘅重點。但係伴隨住即係我哋之前啱啱所講嘅第二次世界大戰咧，其實喺呢一年裏邊咧，有另外一個國家係面對住一個非常之惡劣嘅境地，呢個就係黎巴嫩。所以我哋睇到咧，教宗咧喺個片裏邊咧係講咗好多嘢關於黎巴嫩。黎巴嫩實際上係夾喺以色列同埋敍利亞嘅衝突當中，佢差唔多咧就係被夷為廢墟。喺呢10幾年裏邊咧就冇好日子過。教宗咧係非常之憤怒。同時咧，教宗喺呢一年裏邊咧亦都訪問過非洲國家，佢嘅重點依然咧就係反對呢個種族隔離政策，因為教會咧係力行仁愛，佢哋當然咧唔能夠接受呢一個種族嘅歧視。同樣喺1989年咧，東帝汶同黎巴嫩一樣，都係面對戰爭嘅威脅。東帝汶咧喺獨立咗之後咧，係俾印尼兼併。呢一樣嘢，梵蒂岡係從來都冇承認嘅。教宗若望保禄二世喺呢一年咧，甚至訪問東帝汶。咁當然佢訪問嘅時候咧，就會遇到一個好尷尬嘅問題，究竟佢係親吻定係唔親吻呢一塊土地呢？最後佢係用咗一個好聰明嘅辦法，就係親吻放喺呢一塊土地上邊嘅十字架。最後喺呢一套片裏邊咧，我哋睇到關於天主教會同其他基督教會和解嘅一啲片段。 教宗若望保禄二世咧訪問咗北歐5個國家，而呢5個國家咧，大家都知道，從來咧天主教會都係冇乜太大嘅影響力，因為大部分嘅人咧，佢哋信奉嘅就係路德會信義宗，而呢一個教派咧，基本上就係對天主教會一直以嚟咧都係相當之仇視嘅。咁今次若望保禄二世咧就係主動向佢哋伸出友誼之手，甚至要求佢哋咧就係對天主教會過去所犯嘅錯誤咧係要求寬恕。最後大家可以睇到咧，就係天主教會同埋英國嘅聖公會舉行嘅一啲共同嘅儀式，呢個象徵住咧合一運動嘅進一步發展。
Mikhail Gorbachev's rhythmic footsteps as he walked through the rooms of the Papal Palace on the morning of the 1st of December 1989 marked the last seconds before his great appointment with the Pope and with history. Then came his historic first handshake with the Slavic Pope, who had made the unprecedented gesture of coming some way to meet him, and the Soviet president's face relaxed in a smile. Their historic encounter came just after 11 o'clock. It was a meeting of high symbolic value, as if an impassable wall of non-communication and of aversion to spiritual values had been swept away. It is for this reason that Gorbachev's audience with the Pope captures the collective imagination in the same way as the fall of the Berlin Wall. Gorbachev himself would later recognize that without John Paul II, the events of 1989 in Europe would not have occurred. No pope, at least in modern times, had had the same political impact, and that impact came solely from the strength of his ministry, from his testimony to truth, a testimony that on the 13th of May 1981 had risked being silenced forever when Agca was given an assassin's weapon. This audience in the Vatican provides the symbolic image of the collapse of communism, a collapse that was political, social, and economic. In the private library, in the presence of an entourage of 24 people, including Soviet Foreign Minister Shevardnadze, the Pope spoke first.
Господин президент, мне чрезвычайно приятно иметь случай обратиться к вам.
Before the Kremlin leader's audience, there had been a mass of changes in favor of the East European Church. These stemmed from the new line followed by Gorbachev, who had shaken up the communist regimes, prompting them to show greater openness towards the West. The reply to Gorbachev's line came from a Slavic pope who had never accepted the idea of Europe being split in two. Great changes that gave Karol Wojtyła hope and encouragement had come from Poland. Back in April, the success of the round-table meetings between the government and the Free Trade Union had prompted the Vatican newspaper Osservatore Romano to write the headline, "Poland turns a new page." The Pope acknowledged this achievement by holding a second meeting with Lech Wałęsa, who had already received an audience in 1981. Wałęsa returned to the Vatican to thank his fellow countryman, the Pope, who had been the main author of the birth and success of Solidarność. 1989, the year of the turning point and the year of the Pope's sanctification of the reunification of Europe, came half a century after the outbreak of the Second World War. John Paul II transformed the anniversary into an important lesson, with an apostolic letter and a message to Polish bishops. 50 years had passed since the first act of war, the Nazi invasion of Poland and the defense of Danzig on the 1st of September 1939. Now the Pole who had become Pope sat beside the path of history, recalling before God the massacre of 55 million people, and felt it his duty to draw a lesson from the past, so that the causes that might reignite the conflagration would never again be repeated. Those causes were contempt for mankind and for nations, the totalitarian ideologies that half a century ago took the form of Nazi paganism and Marxist dogma. His lesson was addressed to Europe.
This continent has exported war. Now it is its turn to be the author of peace. It is a Europe that has not yet recovered from its injuries.
No aspect of this slaughter leaves a greater sense of horror than the extermination that was perpetrated by the Holocaust. 1989, year of the miracle of the East, was also the year of genocide in Lebanon. For 13 years, this country had been locked in a dreadful civil war that threatened its very existence. Never before had the Pope been seen to make 130 appeals, trying in every possible way to break through the international apathy that shrouded the tragedy of Lebanon. His most dramatic intervention was that of the 15th of August during the Angelus at Castel Gandolfo. Beirut had just been subjected to one of its most violent bombardments by Syria.
Dinanzi agli occhi di tutto il mondo si sta consumando un processo, direi di genocidio. Un processo che coinvolge la responsabilità dell'intera società internazionale. È il processo che sta portando alla distruzione del Libano. In realtà ci troviamo di fronte ad una minaccia per l'intero ordine della vita internazionale. È una minaccia di natura morale, tanto più dolorosa perché è uno Stato più debole che subisce la violenza o la indifferenza dei più forti. Difatti anche la vita internazionale, anche per la vita internazionale, vale il principio secondo cui non è lecito recare danno al più debole, non è lecito uccidere uno che è più debole.
To everyone's surprise, and without regard for the risk, John Paul II announced that he wanted to visit Lebanon immediately.
Più di una volta ho desiderato di recarmi in Libano. Ogni giorno nella preghiera mi ritrovo in pellegrinaggio laggiù. Per quanto riguarda la mia presenza fisica nella regione, il ministero pastorale fra quei fratelli, sono stato consigliato di soprassedere per il momento a motivo della situazione. In questi giorni essa è ulteriormente peggiorata. Tuttavia, proprio adesso, ancora di più, sento l'interiore imperativo di recarmi in Libano. Prego affinché non mi vengano frapposte difficoltà nell'adempimento di questo ministero pastorale. Nel nome di Dio, mi rivolgo alle autorità siriane chiedendo di cessare i bombardamenti che mirano a distruggere la capitale del Libano e l'intero paese.
Southern Africa was the setting for the opening of his second decade in office, just as Latin America had been in January 1979. After an interval of barely 7 months, John Paul II returned to Africa for the 5th time at the end of April. Madagascar, Réunion, Zambia and Malawi were his destinations, carrying a banner of hope that apartheid might be brought to an end. Such hope had become tangible with the South African withdrawal from Namibia, even if this was gradual. It was precisely in Zambia, one of the most active anti-apartheid countries, that the Pope held a lively debate with the diplomatic corps.
Racism and its expression in systems of social, economic and political discrimination are regarded by the Church as absolutely contrary to Christian faith and love.
Nevertheless, he did not incite violence and called for peaceful methods and reconciliation, and issued an appeal to the Northern Hemisphere to lighten the debt burden that was making the situation of poor countries ever more dramatic. Less than a month later, John Paul II was travelling again. For 10 days at the beginning of June, he visited the lands of Vikings and Lapps, of fields and lakes, of forests and of deep silence, to see Norway, Iceland, Finland, Denmark and Sweden. For John Paul II, the first pope to travel through the northern countries and even into the Arctic Circle with its midnight sun, this was primarily a journey into post-Christian society. It was his most unusual journey, in the sense that even if all the Catholics of the 5 countries had been brought together, they could not have filled St. Peter's Square. But it was also a difficult and delicate visit, because in these lands, which for centuries have been dominated without opposition by the Lutheran Reform, Catholicism is regarded as foreign, and the Pope is seen as a despotic and authoritarian Antichrist. The visit confirmed this attitude, with many Lutheran bishops displaying ostentatious coldness, including the Bishop of Oslo, who reminded his guest of the Galileo issue, and the Bishop of Roskilde in Denmark, who would not allow the Pope to speak in his cathedral. Public opinion, at least as reflected by the newspapers, proved to be more favorable to Wojtyła, compared with the attitude of the official Danish Church, for example. 1-0 for the Pope. This was the favorable comment on his presence made by a Copenhagen newspaper in reply to hardline Protestants who had decided to gag the Pope by preventing him from speaking. In Finland, however, Archbishop Wikström marked the prayer meeting with an unusual invitation to lunch, together with his wife Birgitta. The two of them sat on either side of their guest. The northern journey made by John Paul II aroused a sort of Copernican revolution among many Lutherans. They had expected the Pope to be a conservative, locked in an ivory tower of his own infallibility, or rigid in his own moral strictness. For 10 days, they were surprised to find themselves facing a Bishop of Rome who held out his hand to ill-mannered Lutheran prelates and sought forgiveness for Catholic misdeeds of the past. In order to reach Santiago de Compostela on the 19th of August for the World Youth Meeting, the Pope took up his walking stick, indeed his pilgrim's staff, and wore the brown shoulder cape decorated with 2 shells on the chest. He thus symbolically joined the millions of European pilgrims who for 11 centuries have followed the path to Santiago, and joined the vast stream of young people, almost 400,000 of them, who had responded to his convocation to Galicia for an immersion in Christianity. He was present at the spectacular launching of the Bota Fumero, the enormous 55-kilogram incense burner which is raised by 8 people, swinging from side to side as it climbs almost to the ceiling of the transept. The pilgrimage was not made in the spirit of the Iberian reconquest, with the Moors as the enemy, but was intended as a shared journey through poverty and the misadventures of life. In line with these hopes, the Pope told the enthusiastic young people who crowded Mount de Gozo, the mountain of joy in the outskirts of Santiago,
Now at the threshold of the year 2000, the Church wishes to continue to be humanity's travelling companion. Our humanity, which is sometimes afflicted by a sense of pain and abandonment because of numerous betrayals, still needs to be guided towards salvation through the dense fog that looms before us when the conscience of the common Christian calling becomes weaker, even among the faithful.
His 5th Asian journey, conducted in October, made advanced headlines because of its flight plan, which for the first time took the papal aircraft across the USSR and Taiwan, while China refused permission. His itinerary covered 39,000 kilometers in 10 days, traveling to Seoul in Korea for the closing of the International Eucharist Congress, and to Indonesia and the islands of Mauritius. One of the main issues was the intricate situation in East Timor, the former Portuguese colony that had been occupied and annexed by Indonesia in 1975. The Vatican had never recognized this annexation. The sensitivity of the visit was symbolized by the issue of whether he should kiss the earth. Had he done so on reaching the airport of Dili, the Pope would symbolically have recognized its independence, while avoiding the gesture would have supported East Timor's absorption as the 27th Indonesian province. In the end, the following compromise was devised. As he came to the altar, set up in a vast flat area near the sea, the Pope kissed the cross, which was placed on the ground. The crowd understood and applauded. The visit made by Robert Runcie, Archbishop of Canterbury and Primate of the Anglican Communion, from the 29th September to the 2nd of October, was the ecumenical event of the year. After 2 decades of theological dialogue, no one could deny that the relationship between the two churches was stalled on the issue of the admission of women to the priesthood in some provinces of the Anglican community. But the situation worsened when the Church of England itself opened its doors to women priests. The Vespers, sung by Runcie and by the Pope at San Gregorio al Cielo, were rich in emotion and historical overtones. It was from this point that several monks had set out 1,400 years before to evangelize England, dispatched by Pope Gregory the Great. They were led by Augustine, the first Bishop of Canterbury. Months later, when he sang the Te Deum of thanks for 1989 in the Roman Church of Jesus, Pope Wojtyla was reminded of the Te Deum that had been sung 2 days earlier by 90-year-old Cardinal Tomaszek in Prague Cathedral, in the presence of newly elected President Václav Havel. That Te Deum symbolically brought to an end the year of 1989 and more than 4 decades of communist power in many Eastern nations.
呢一套片對大家有啲咩啟示呢？實際上呢一套片呢有2個主題，一個就係東歐變革，另外一個呢就係戰爭嘅威脅。1989年嘅東歐變革呢，可以講話風起雲湧，係非常之激盪人心。